Hey, everybody, please remember to subscribe, like, and share. Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back into our little show here. I got Larry the lawyer back with me, and we're going to do something different for our upcoming videos we got going. This is going to be a little promo video. Larry, how are you, man?
Doing fine, thanks. How are you, Chris?
Great. How was your vacation?
Vacation was lovely. We did a week in the Pocono Mountains near the Delaware Water Gap in Pennsylvania. It was just very restful, very into nature. We went to a wolf preserve. We went to the local Indian museum, which they actually call an Indian museum and not a Native American museum. And other than that, we saw a lot of waterfalls and just had a restful week.
Okay. Well, glad to have you back and glad you enjoyed your vacation. So we're going to take a different topic here. We're going to go into some of the Pacific in World War II. So kind of lead us in. It's December 6, 1941. What's going on in the world?
Okay, so the issue is what is going on. The Japanese and the Chinese are in the midst of fighting the Second Sino-Japanese War. And this has been going on basically since 1937. The Japanese have invaded China. They've taken Manchuria. They've set up a Japanese sphere of influence there called Manchukuo. They've also taken part of Mongolia and are moving along the south coast of China. They'll have taken Shanghai and heading to the capital city of Nanking. When you hear the history, many of you have heard of the rape of Nanking. When the Japanese actually conquered the city, they just destroyed, killed people, raped women, made a whole mess of the situation. So on December 6th, the Japanese, and by saying December 6th, we're talking about December 6th. If we're talking about December 6th in Japan, we're actually talking about December 7th because they're on the other side of the international date line. So when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, it was actually December 8th in Japan, but December 7th in the United States, in Hawaii. So basically what's going on? The United States and Japan are having very unamicable peace negotiations. The U.S. is very anti-Japanese aggression in Southeast Asia and in Asia in general, in the islands. They're embargoing various goods on Japan, the most important being oil. So if Japan can't get oil from the U.S., and obviously Japan's not getting oil from Russia at this point because Japan and Russia have already had a brief altercation up on the Mongolian border, and the Russian troops under General Zhukov gave the Japanese a bloody nose. So the Japanese have not and actually will not again attempt to take on the Russians. It's not 1895 when the Japanese destroyed the Tsarist Russian armies and navy. So here we are. Where can the Japanese get oil if they can't make an arrangement with the United States? And the answer is the Dutch East Indies, or today Indonesia. So if the Japanese are going to go to war and increase their Asian sphere of influence, they have to go against Indonesia. Or they have to go against the United States, or both. So what's going on? The Japanese are negotiating with the United States, but they are now told that if they do not settle with the United States instantaneously, they're going to go to war with the United States. Now, they do not tell the United States this. The United States is still negotiating in good faith. So we're on December 6th, and the Japanese Admiral Yamamoto, who is the head of the, actually not head of the Navy, Navy Commander-in-Chief, has given the orders to Nagimo, who's head of the carrier task force, that he's going to attack Pearl Harbor, Hawaii tomorrow, December 7th in the United States, December 8th in Japan. Now, the orders are that the attack is going to be 6 o'clock, give or take, or 7 o'clock, give or take, Hawaiian time. A message, a declaration of war is supposed to be presented by the Japanese on December 7th to the United States government at the time, just before the time the Japanese should be attacking Pearl Harbor, which is about, if I do my time zones right, it's either noon in the U.S. or 1 p.m. in the U.S. on December 7th, when that the declaration of war is going to be issued. So it turns out the Japanese, the United States made no last proposal to Japan. So obviously, we all know our history. On December 7th, the date that will live in infamy, the Japanese bombed the U.S. base at Pearl Harbor and Hickam Field and Kaneohe Naval Air Station on the island of Oahu. What they're trying to do is they're trying to destroy the U.S. fleet. Now, two things happen that basically drive a wedge into all the Japanese battle plans. They send 2 waves of bombers at Pearl Harbor. Torpedo planes make up the first wave for the most part, though there's some regular Zeros and fighters and dive bombers, Bettys. They attack Battleship Row. They knock out 3 battleships for the duration. The Oklahoma, which turns turtle, the Arizona, which is blown to smithereens, and the Nevada, which is in a different part of Pearl Harbor, but is already in the process of being decommissioned, so it's never raised again. So if you go to Pearl Harbor now, there are, though not many people know it, there are actually 2 battleships in ruins on the bottom of Pearl Harbor. One is the Arizona and the other is the Nevada. So the first mistake, as luck would have it, the U.S. had, up until about 3 or 4 days before, 3 aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor: the Enterprise, the Hornet, and I believe the Yorktown, though I'm not 100% sure. It might have been the Saratoga. But anyway, none of these aircraft carriers are in port, so none of them are hit. The second big mistake that the Japanese made, and they had scheduled a 3rd wave to go in after the supply ships, but more important, after the oil facilities, the storage sheds, and everything else. The 3rd wave was never sent. Therefore, the Pearl Harbor was able to recover. They did not lose shipping oil and anything like that. A number of ships were sunk. As I said, all but 3 of them were back in action. One ship was able to get under, one of the battleships was able to get underway. That was, oh God, I said the Nevada before, and I was wrong. The Nevada was the actual battleship that was able to get underway and attempt to move out of Pearl Harbor, but the Japanese then focused their forces on the Nevada, and she beached herself, so she was also able to come back and fight the war. West Virginia was hit, California was hit, Pennsylvania was already in dry dock, so though she was hit, it wasn't serious consequences. The other ship, the ship that I drew my blank on, it was the Indiana that's still in the Pearl Harbor, lying in there, not the Nevada. So now the important thing to look at is what's going on in the world. Now, most people don't realize it, but the Japanese at this time have a major empire, a major Pacific empire. Much of it was islands that they took from the Germans during and after World War I. But the Japanese had also expanded into most of the Marianas, most of the Gilberts, most of the Carolines, most of the Gilberts. They actually had bases in the Solomons, which was off the northeastern and eastern shores of Australia. You've heard of the Solomons. The major island is Guadalcanal, but we'll talk a little bit about that. So what happens? So on December 7th, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. But on December 8th, which would be December 9th for the Japanese, they attack the Philippines. They attack the Dutch East Indies. They get ready to attack the Malay Peninsula. So they're going after the Allies. Now they catch MacArthur, who's the head of both the U.S. forces in the Philippines and the actual Philippine army, totally off guard. Brereton, who is MacArthur's air commander at the time, has his planes laid up on Clark Field. They're sitting ducks. The main naval yard at Cavite is destroyed. We're not talking about carriers at Cavite. We're not even talking about battleships, but cruisers, destroyers, PT boats are destroyed. So basically, MacArthur's Navy and Air Force does not exist. And, plenty of things could be done, have been done. So we now have MacArthur, basically Luzon, the main island of the Philippines, is denuded of air cover. There's a few planes left. It's denuded of sea cover. I think there's one light cruiser and a number of PT boats left, maybe one destroyer or a DE. And so that's where we stand. Now,
So what is,
7 o'clock.
sorry to interrupt you. What is the mindset of the Japanese military high command? Or are they thinking that they're going to knock out the Pacific Fleet and the United States are going to be like, okay, we give up here, we'll negotiate? I mean, what are they thinking?
Okay, supposedly they're thinking that they're going to be able to destroy the United States fleet and then make an arrangement with the United States, come to a peace agreement where the United States recognizes Japan, cedes Japan, Guam, Wake Island, Tonga and Samoa, and part of most of New Guinea and the Dutch East Islands and part of Australia. So basically, they want to give the U.S. a major black eye and force the U.S. to the negotiating table.
Okay.
And that's basically what we know now. They're hoping that we're an effete democracy, and we're not going to have the willpower to stay the course. Though I don't want to say it, a lot like Vietnam and Afghanistan happening now, which we don't have the willpower to stay the course. But different times, different wars, so to speak. The important thing is, and one of the reasons why the U.S. gets so angry is when the Japanese present their declaration of war, they're 22 minutes too late. The planes have been raining down bombs on Pearl Harbor for 22 minutes when that declaration is handed to the U.S. State Department. So the U.S., the Japanese blindsided us. They caught us with our defenses down, and they started deliberately attacking us before they declared war upon us. Obviously, this doesn't mean a heck of a lot in negotiations in today's day and age, but it meant something then. They did a first strike before an actual declaration of war. And the reason they did it, two reasons actually: raw materials that they were not getting because of the U.S. and Allies blockade, and to get a protective ring and cordon around the Japanese Empire.
So we know about Yamamoto's famous statement about a sleeping giant. Any knowledge, did he warn the Japanese military command, hey, we don't want to do this, this is not going to work out?
Well, he supposedly he informed Tojo and Togo, who was the Prime Minister General Tojo, and Naval Affairs Minister Admiral Togo, who was the guy who defeated the Tsar's navy at Tsushima during the Russo-Japanese War 40 years before in 1895. He told them that it's not going to work. I mean, if the U.S. mobilizes, we cannot beat them. His orders were to go and attack Pearl Harbor, which he did.
Okay, because he had been here. I think didn't he train or something in the United States years before? Or,
he had been a naval attaché to the United States for a while.
Okay.
So yeah, he had been in the United States. He knew what he was talking about.
Yeah, I knew he had been here, trained or something, but anyway, he knew the United States industrial capabilities and knew that it was not going to end well.
So most people, when they think about the first 6 months of World War II, they think that it's the Japanese taking a whole mess of islands in the Pacific. The Japanese already had those islands in the Pacific. What they went after was what they didn't have. Because the Japanese had Formosa, the Japanese, which is now Taiwan. The Japanese had Korea already, much of China. What the Japanese went after was some of the islands off Australia, the northern coast of Australia, Guam, but they were more after the islands of the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia, because that's where the oil was. They were also more after attacking the British Empire, going after Hong Kong, and ultimately Burma. And then in 1942-43, they actually made an attack into India, which failed. So they were actually looking to improve their resources, getting the oil. The most important thing was getting the oil from and rubber from Indonesia to Japan. I'm sorry, from Dutch East Indies, which are now Indonesia, to Japan, because that was what they were need. That's what they needed most. Without oil, without rubber, they weren't moving.
Okay, so what exactly before the United States went to the island hopping. What was the Japanese strategy? Because we know they got turned back at the Coral Sea and Midway, which led the United States to, implement theirs. But what did they do? I mean, what was their end goal here, or what was they trying to achieve?
Their goal was to, first of all, their goal was to solidify Asia. They took the Malay Peninsula, which isolated the main British base in Singapore, and then they crossed the straits and took Singapore. They took Burma. They wanted to. They basically, what their main idea was to take New Guinea, take the Solomon Islands, and then cordon off Australia so that the U.S. could not reinforce Australia or New Zealand. They never were anywhere near enough to do anything to New Zealand, but with their bases in the Solomons, they could have, and their bases in Rabaul to the north east of Australia. Their bases on New Guinea after they invaded New Guinea, they could very well have cut off Australia from the United States. Now, the first main Japanese assault, land assault, was in the Philippine Islands. After bombing Clark Field and Cavite, they landed at Lingayen Gulf in Luzon, and they moved on Manila. Now, MacArthur knew that he didn't have the troops to fight off Manila. He had two really spectacular generals who led a fighting retreat, and that was Jones and Wainwright, who led a fighting retreat south of Manila to where the United States had set up their defensive lines, which was on the Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor. They actually stopped the Japanese. Japanese had total air and sea control. So they were, while the U.S. could not land anybody or to get more men, or either more Filipinos or Americans into the area, other than bringing in some of the Filipino scouts from Mindanao, which is the second largest island, the U.S. was fighting a diminishing war, which the Japanese and did not realize how bad the United States was hurting. Because right before the U.S. ended up surrendering, the Japanese forces had pockets and pouches and bulges in the United States lines in Bataan. And the U.S., led by, again, Jones and Wainwright, took apart these bulges, these indentations in the American line. So the Japanese were very surprised when the American soldiers and the Filipinos on Bataan actually approached them to surrender. They didn't think it was going to happen that soon. And then Corregidor fell even quicker. But the most, what the Japanese wanted to do was really, they were an expansionist country and they wanted to expand their empire. They basically, their major goal, the way I see it, was conquering China. The Japanese and the Chinese have never gotten along. China has invaded Japan a number of times. Japanese had fought a war with China in the early part of the 1900s, and this would be the second Sino-Japanese war. And the Japanese were a economic, military, industrial power. The Chinese were not. You were fighting, the Chinese were buttressed. When Sun Yat-sen came to power and threw over the monarchy or the empire or whatever you want to call it, And then when Chiang Kai-shek became a premier of China, they started to industrialize. They started to import weaponry, but they were so far behind the Japanese that really, without their allies, they had no hope of holding on to China. That's why you hear of, later on in the war, you hear of the Lido Road and the Burma Road and the airlift over the Himalayas to bring in supplies and ammunition and weapons to the Chinese. Without these roads, through Burma at the time, over the Himalayas, Chinese may very well not have been able to survive the war. Another reason that the Chinese were having problems was that China was involved in the beginnings of their communist revolution. Even though Mao and Chiang had made an agreement that they would stop fighting each other and fight the Japanese, it never really happened. They were each fighting each other as well as the Japanese throughout the war. And then there was, at other times, there were numerous Chinese warlords who would not be holding to either Chiang Kai-shek or Mao. And one of them at one point actually captured and kidnapped Chiang Kai-shek and took him out of play for a while. This was, if I'm not mistaken, this was just before the war. But these were the reasons why China was not functioning. So the Japanese took Guam and took Wake Island in December of 1941. Wake was their first punch in the eye, because the Wake Island, with their little Marine garrison and their civilian employees, held out for 10 days. And the first Japanese ship that was sunk by the Allies was sunk at Wake Island. The Japanese destroyed the Dutch fleet in the Dutch East Indies. Japanese bombed and destroyed the two British battleships, the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, in Singapore, before they actually invaded Singapore, crossing the straits from Malaysia, from the Malay Peninsula. The Japanese were not able to take any of the other American islands. The Japanese were not able to take Samoa or take Tonga. They were certainly not able to take Midway. So your Japanese forces are very extended at this point. You have them pushing westward towards Burma and India. You have them pressing southward, taking the islands of Indonesia, the small islands to the north of Australia, and they're making a major invasion push on New Guinea, and they're taking some of the islands in the Solomons. So that's basically where we are, and that's the first 6 months in the war, where nothing the Allies does goes right. As I said, we lose Hong Kong, we lose Ceylon, we lose Singapore, we lose the Dutch East Indies, we lose much or many of New Guinea. So that would be, so now we have to figure out what happens next. Chris, are you with me?
Yeah, I'm listening to you.
Okay, so now the Americans have to figure out what goes next. So what they did was, after the fall of Bataan, or just before the fall of Bataan, MacArthur is in Corregidor, which is an island off the coast of the Philippines. It's between Luzon and Leyte and Celebes and Mindanao. So the President Roosevelt, who can't stand MacArthur, hates him, thinks he's a martinet, he's going to be a rival, has once called him the most dangerous man in America, pulls him out to lead the Southwest Pacific Theater of Operations out of Australia. And they get him out. He gives them the Medal of Honor, and he makes him head of the Allied forces in Australia. And Governor Curtin, Governor General Curtin of Australia, is surreptitiously asked by the US government to ask that MacArthur be leader of the Allied forces, which Curtin does. So MacArthur, aside from commanding the American forces, is commanding the Australian forces as the titular head in Australia. Now, the Japanese land on New Guinea. They take Lae and Salamanca, and they move on Port Moresby, which is the New Guinea capital. They also bomb the sea port at Milne Bay. Now we're talking about, and New Guinea is a huge island. It's probably maybe it's a quarter to a third the size of Australia, and most of it is part of Indonesia. Part of it is independent at this point, and that's where most of the fighting with the U.S. and the Australian forces are. Now, let's look at the difference between what the United States is doing with her allies in the Pacific and what the U.S. is doing with her allies in Europe. Now, once Europe and the European theater, North Africa, what's happening is that the Allies are acting in concert. Though Eisenhower's commander-in-chief, he's basically, his units are interposed. They have Free French, British, and Americans and Canadians fighting together, not fighting separately. If you jump ahead to 1944 and you look at the Battle of the Bulge, Montgomery is given command of all forces north of the Bulge. Bradley is given command of all forces south of the Bulge. Now, the vast majority of the forces south of the Bulge are either Free French or American. The forces north of the Bulge are Montgomery's British forces, some Free French, Canadians, but also the U.S. First Army, Courtney Hodges' First Army. And they're all under Montgomery's command. Actually, Montgomery's under Eisenhower's command, but Montgomery is running that sector and leading American troops, commanding American troops. Now, that is not happening in the Pacific. The Dutch were commanding the Dutch East Indies. The British are commanding the Indian troops out of India and Burma. Even when the Americans come into Burma with Stilwell and Merrill's Marauders, they're an independent command in the area. The Australians, though Blamey is subservient's a lousy word. MacArthur is Blamey's, Field Marshal Blamey's superior. Blamey is running the Australian show on New Guinea, while MacArthur is on the other side of the island and attacking the islands north of New Guinea, Operation Cartwheel. So this is what. So the Americans are now have to decide how they're going to go back against Japan. Now, the Navy, commanded by Ernest King, and he's in Washington, and the Army, of course, is commanded by General Marshall, also in Washington, trying to decide the best way to go after the Japanese. Now, they've already made a decision that Europe is going to be first. The Nazis, they're going to use more force in Europe in a smaller geographical perspective and area than they are going to use in Asia, India, in the Pacific Ocean, Asian theater, Indian theater, Chinese theater, and it's basically racist. They want to they want to take care of their white brothers before they have to worry about their Asian allies. Australia is a bit different because they are a white nation. But that's the way it breaks down. Now, King wants the Navy and the Marines to take care of everything, and this is the Central Pacific Plan, and basically the island hopping that you hear about. MacArthur, on the other hand, with Marshall, wants to move up Southwest Asia into, Southeast Asia, the southwestern frontier. He wants to capture New Guinea, capture the islands around New Guinea, and then go back to the Philippines. So everybody's fighting with each other. Roosevelt decides that there are going to be three, maybe even four American theaters of operation. There's going to be the Central Pacific. There's going to be the Southwest Pacific, which is where MacArthur is commanding. There's going to be the Southeast Asia, which ultimately will be Joe Stilwell, and there's going to be the Chinese, which will also be under Stilwell. And then there'll be the various allied commands. The British, the U.S. is not going to have a commander-in-chief in the area who is going to take over the British in India. That's going to be left to the British Army. They're not going to take over the command of Malaysia and Singapore and Burma. Those are all going to be left to the British Army, and Britain will lose all of them. They're not going to take over the Dutch East Indies, which will be left to the Netherlands, which will lose them. Not all of them, most of them. And the Australians are going to fight their own mini war in New Guinea at this point and later on. Now, again, in Europe, the British and the Americans have, in effect, separate air forces, but they have a united command. In the Pacific, the Australians have their own Navy and their own Air Force, and luckily, most of their commanders were able to work well with the Americans and Air Force. So now the Japanese, now we're in April, May, June of 1941. What's going on? The Japanese are trying to move more forces into the Solomon Islands. The Japanese are going to attempt to take possibly the Aleutians, but definitely Midway Island. So this is the next thing the Japanese are going to concentrate on. Now, the American Navy is still being hit and beaten by the Japanese. At this point, they're down to 3 carriers. They have actually, I'm sorry. At this point, they have 4 carriers. The Wasp will be destroyed after Espirito Santos. There's a naval battle in the Coral Sea, and this is the first battle where the U.S. holds its own against the Japanese Navy. The U.S. has 2 major carriers at the Coral Sea. The Lexington is sunk, and the Yorktown is severely damaged, but the Japanese think the Yorktown is either sunk or has been refloated and is going back with tremendous damage. So the Japanese at this point think that there are only 2 carriers available. Now, the Enterprise and the Hornet in April of 1942 are steaming towards Japan. What's going to happen is the American Naval Air Force, technically the American Army Air Force, under the command of Brigadier General, at this point he's still a colonel, Jimmy Doolittle, is going to take bombers off these 2 carriers, or actually only off the Hornet, and bomb Japan. And it happens. These guys, though they wanted to get closer to Japan so they could retrieve their bombers after the bombing run, but they are discovered by some Japanese fishing fleet, and they know that these fleets have radio, and they're 99% sure that their position has been radioed back to the 4 main islands. So they bomb the Japanese, and their plan is, after bombing the Japanese, try like hell to get to unoccupied China. And they're lucky. They get the right kind of winds. They are able to coast and save fuel now and again, and they do their bombing runs. They don't cause any major problems, but it's a tremendous boost to the U.S. morale. And the Japanese, who've been told that the enemy will never be able to reach their islands because of their empire, gets a kick in the pants because the U.S. was able to bomb Tokyo and Osaka and Yokohama, the 3 major cities, and most of their planes were able to escape to China. I mean, most of the planes crash landed, but the vast majority of the pilots were able to escape, though a few were captured and killed by Japanese forces, and a few others were captured and sent to prisoner of war camps where they survived the war. So now the Japanese have set up their next major attack, which is Midway Island. Midway Island is called Midway Island because it's midway from Hawaii to Japan, or midway from the U.S. to Asia, however you want to call it. That's why it's Midway Island. The Japanese are going to use Midway Island as a place to set off their invasions of Samoa, Tonga. The Aleutians are being discussed at this point, more so than the Americans than not Japanese. Japan, and to continue their fighting on New Guinea, and probably to take Hawaii. So this is where we are. So the Americans at this point, in the end of May, beginning in June in 1942, cracked cracked the Japanese naval code. Now, it's not 100%. They can't read 100% of each message, but they know that the Japanese are going to attack. Now, the Japanese have 6 carriers, and they have found out that the Japanese have split those carriers. So they don't know if the main attack is going to be on the Aleutian Islands, which are U.S. territorial islands off the coast of Alaska, and now part of the state of Alaska, then part of the territory of Alaska, or are they going to attack Midway? The code-breaking section in Washington believes that the attack is going to be on Midway, and that it's going to be a diversion to the Aleutians. Now, just as a little aside, at this point, my father is a Seabee and is being transferred up into Alaska to build the airstrip in Nome and Fairbanks. There is more concrete in that airfield that my father helped build in Nome than in the whole state of Alaska at that time. So interestingly enough, my father's in Alaska. So what does the chief of the intelligence force tell the military on Midway Island to do? Chris, do you know the answer to this one?
I do, but I can't remember off the top of my head what it is now.
Okay, so what he does is he tells Midway Island to send a message to Washington without using scramblers or code, telling them that they are having problems with their water condenser.
Yeah, that's right.
So the Japanese intercept this message, send it by their naval code back to Japan, stating that target AE, which they're trying to figure out if AE is the Aleutians or Midway, has stated that they are having problems with their water condenser. So we now know that the Japanese attack is going to be at Midway. So June 4th, 1942, the United States brings 2 carriers, the Enterprise and the Hornet, northeast of Midway Island. And they bring the 3rd carrier, the Yorktown, who the Japanese do not think is either sunk or major repairs and will not be able to join the fight. But they bring up the Yorktown after the Battle of the Coral Sea. They've made miraculous repairs on it, and she's now steaming on full power under Fitzjohn Fletcher, Admiral Fletcher, while Halsey is supposed to be in command of the Enterprise and the Hornet, but Halsey is laid up in a hospital in Honolulu with a rash, and he can't get out of bed.
Yeah, I remember that. Psoriasis, right?
So Nimitz, who's the Allied commander and who's ultimately going to be the commander in the whole Central Pacific on the island hopping, comes to Halsey and asks him who he wants to command his carriers. Now, there are a couple admirals with carrier expertise in Hawaii who can lead those carriers, including the captains of the Enterprise and the Hornet, who can be promoted. But Halsey tells Spruance that he wants a cruiser commander, Admiral Raymond Spruance, to command. There's a great movie called Midway. I'm sure many of you, and I'm sure Chris, you've seen it.
Oh yeah.
Spruance comes into Halsey's room and asks Halsey, "What the hell's wrong with you, having me command your carriers?" And Halsey says to Spruance something to the effect, "You kept your cruisers with my carriers everywhere we went in the Pacific. You know as much tactics as I do. You're the man for this job." And then Spruance asked Halsey, "What do you want me to do?" And Halsey said, "You are the commander. You will do what is necessary. You will command our carriers, my carriers, and you will do the job." So Admiral Ray Spruance is up there. The Japanese are ready to attack Midway. The Japanese send 2 carriers and others of their fleet up to attack the Aleutian Islands. They actually invade 3 of the islands, Adak, Attu, and Kiska, and they bomb the Alaskan city of Dutch Harbor. So this is the first area on the U.S. mainland that has been bombed by a foreign entity.
Okay. So then the next time we start in with the island, whose strategy was this?
I'm sorry?
Whose strategy was it?
This is the grand strategy of Marshall, King, Nimitz, and MacArthur together.
Okay.
It's basically Marshall and King, though. King is head of the Navy, Marshall is head of the Army, and they're planning it. Roosevelt, of course, makes the final decision, which I've already told you what it is, that he's going to go in 4 separate directions. But the most important one for us at this time is the Central Pacific island hopping led by Nimitz, and the Operation New Guinea Cartwheel Philippine Axis Southwest Asia led by MacArthur. Halsey is going to be running the show for Nimitz. But Halsey is also going to be helping out MacArthur, because Halsey has what's called his fast carrier fleet. He doesn't have it yet, but he will have it. And these fast carriers are going to be alternating where they're needed the most. So right now, when we go next, we're going to talk about Halsey, we're going to talk about Nimitz, we're going to talk about MacArthur, but the main things we're going to talk about is what happens at Midway, and then what happens at Guadalcanal, and what happens in New Guinea, because these are the bases of the U.S. strategy to knock out the Japan's Pacific Empire and ultimately attack Japan.
Perfect. That sounds great.